Hey all, Ron here from Military Images Magazine with a new episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail. Today's story begins in May 2024 at the Civil War Show in Mansfield, Ohio. You Civil War collectors and relic hunters and others interested in all kinds of artifacts, you know very well this is one of the best shows in the country. And I've been setting up there for, gosh, years now. Military Images has a table. I always bring my scanner to Mansfield, as I do to most of the shows, and I have great fun meeting all the collectors who bring by their most unique and interesting images to share. It's kind of a little antiques roadshow routine without the cameras. We look at the image, we talk about what we see, then I scan the image, and sometimes we'll call it up on the image or call up the image on the screen. We'll look at the details and just sort of geek out over these images. And most of them are portraits. We also will sometimes talk about the value. At this particular show in Mansfield, Ohio, the 2024 show, a collector named George Wilkinson came up to the table. George is focused on the 4th Michigan Infantry, and he has a great site. I'll put the link in the comments field below. It's really well done, and it's completely dedicated to the regiment. I had met George at a previous show, and I was familiar with the great work he did covering the 4th Michigan. He really has done a fantastic job with these Michiganders. But I was not prepared for this image that he allowed me to scan, and we talked about it because it is just quite unique. It's about roughly 8 by 10, these two smaller images mounted on a cardstock mount. It's actually two views of a table, and it happens to be, and I'll show one of the close-ups here. It happens to be the surrender table, a miniature of the surrender table used by Ulysses S. Grant and Robert E. Lee at Appomattox. So let's take a look at the top of the table. It is a handcrafted work of art. It's brilliant. It gleams with symbols of the late war. In the middle of the tabletop, you can see a blue, or what would be a blue enameled ring of 38 stars, one for each state. And that is the states as of 1879, which I'll get to in just a little bit. They're surrounding the word peace, which is emblazoned with rays of unity coming out. Along the base of the ring, you can see the Latin phrase Esto Perpetua, let it continue forever. On one side of the ring, the Stars and Stripes is spread in its full glory, and on the other side is a furled banner of the doomed Confederate nation. Above those two flags, you'll see a relief of Grant himself, and below it, there's another relief of an apple tree representing that story about Grant and Lee at Appomattox meeting beneath an apple tree. Surrounding that ring of peace with the stars, you can see a dove with outstretched wings and a branch of promise in its beak, overlooking vignettes that celebrate America, celebrate our country. Palmetto and pine trees, industry and agriculture, commerce, education, religious freedom, and a stack of muskets. Now, there's an inscription along the top, which you might have already noticed. It reveals some interesting details. It says it was a presentation to Grant by ex-Confederate Frank T. Weldon. There's another inscription along the side edge, which is not visible here, but it's visible on the other image that I showed a moment ago, celebrating his recent and much publicized world travels. It says, quote, "Welcome home. The whole country feels itself honored by the honors you have received from the great nations of the earth." So this was probably the most unique scan that I made, and I made many of them at the Mansfield show. This photograph, this pair of photographs really stuck with me. It's just so unusual, so distinctive. And by the time I got home, I was determined to learn more about this miniature and I wanted to find out what happened to it. So I started with the ex-Confederate whose name is emblazoned on the table. He is actually Frank Thomas Weldon. I had to do a lot of research into genealogy and other records, going way down the research rabbit hole. Frank Thomas Weldon, he hailed from Mississippi. His father was Irish born George Weldon, and he had arrived in the United States with his family as a teenager in the 1820s. The family began their American journey in Philadelphia, which is going to play a role here in a little bit. George, the father, struck out from Mississippi, became a successful architect in Natchez, and married an Illinois native named Francis. That event happened in 1835. In Natchez, they started a family, 2 children, Mary, the eldest, and then Frank, the ex-Confederate. Frances, the mother, died tragically in September of 1839, less than a month after bringing Frank into the world. She may have died, at least dying a month after it must have been, or very likely complications from childbirth. George, the father, now a widow, and his children, Mary and Frank, left Natchez for Fayette in neighboring Jefferson County, Mississippi. George never remarried. He was, it turns out, a staunch Unionist, and he opposed secession, refused to support the Confederate government or its military, and after the war was over, he publicly said that he regretted that the war ever took place. Meanwhile, Frank, the guy responsible for this table, was a law student in Fayette as the war enveloped the country. It is likely that he followed his father's footsteps politically. I wasn't able to find any evidence that he joined the Confederate Army. Notably, his name is not on the roll of a Natchez militia company called the Tom Weldon Rifles. Tom Weldon happened to be his uncle, George Weldon's brother, Thomas Weldon Jr. The rebels became Company L of the 44th Mississippi Infantry. Now, you would think that if young Frank would have joined any militia unit, any regiment, it would have been his Uncle Tom's regiment, or his Uncle Tom's company that then became part of the regiment. In fact, Frank's whereabouts in the 1860s are unclear. At least according to my research, he literally disappears off of the map. It seems that maybe he intentionally kept a low profile. We don't know what happened to him. At least I haven't found out yet. But he may have left Mississippi for his ancestral home back in Ireland to wait out the war. He may have relocated to Philadelphia, where, by the way, his grandfather and other relatives left, because it was only his father who left Philadelphia to go to Mississippi. Frank is gone for the better part of a decade. In fact, I'm unable to find his record picking up again until 1872. It's 7 years after the war. In that year, 1872, Frank marries a Philadelphia woman named Mary Jane Clark. They begin a family that grows to include 6 children, 5 of them who survived to adulthood. Frank, by this time, remember, he was a law student. Well, he went on to get his degree and to become part of a law firm and a successful attorney. Now, getting to this table, you got to wonder what motivated him to commission this miniature table. Was it national pride, an appreciation for Grant, gratitude for his Irish immigrant father who found success in Mississippi? Any of these things might have prompted him to act. His self-identification as an ex-Confederate underscores his connection to the South and secession. Of that, we can be sure. The golden table, the miniature table, its iconography and the inscriptions may have been Frank's way of closing a violent, bloody chapter that reshaped the country and his life and his family's life. What we do know is that the influences that led him to commission this miniature table coincided with a singular event that I referenced earlier: former President Grant's trip around the globe. It was more than a 2-year vacation to see the world. During that time, he met with the world's leaders, was hailed as the man who saved the United States and saved the experiment of government by the people. Grant, he left in 1877, he returns in 1879, and he eventually makes his way to Philadelphia, where he receives a hero's welcome on December 16th, 1879. He's the retired general who led the U.S. Army to victory. He's a 2-term president, globe-trotting celebrity. He receives the best that Philadelphia can offer. He steps into an elegant horse-drawn barouche and sits in a plush seat of honor for a grand review through the heart of the Cradle of Liberty, a massive parade to celebrate Grant. Here's an engraving of Grant that I want to share with you. And you can see that he is in his barouche and he is riding through the streets of Philadelphia. So here's a little bit of a scene setter for you. That barouche carrying Grant and the mayor of Philadelphia, you can see him seated next to Grant. He's William S. Stokely. They are sitting beneath a canopy of clear blue skies and bright sunshine on that December day in 1879. It's perfect weather for a parade. The pageantry is incredible. You can see a little bit of it here. He's surrounded by cavalrymen resplendent in plumed helmets and sabers. They're accompanied by other carriages and marching troops and joined by myriad civic and business groups. This long column rolls through roped-off streets with the hero one newspaper proclaims as the great guests. Along the streets, cheering citizens are crowded on makeshift stands and throngs, packed sidewalks against a backdrop of bunting draped buildings. There's little boys darting in and out, hawking photographs of Grant, maps of the parade route, and other souvenirs. At the intersection of Chestnut and 8th Streets, Grant's barouche passes by a jewelry store. Had Grant been able to peer into the display window, I'm sure he wouldn't have been able to see because so many people were lining the streets. But if he could, he might have glimpsed the little miniature table which happened to be on display. So here we can actually place the table in Philadelphia while Grant was there. Now, let me tell you about the parade. According to estimates, 40 to 60,000 people participated in the 12-mile-long parade, upwards of 15,000 from the military and the remainder from governmental agencies, manufacturers, shipbuilders, telegraph and express companies, various trade groups, political clubs, fraternal organizations, and many more. One of the businesses in the procession, called the Consumers Ice Company, featured a highly decorated wagon drawn by a dozen white horses. Inside the wagon, 6 massive ice blocks were carved into the forms of an eagle, a swan, a cannon, and other shapes. Grant and his entourage stepped out of the barouche and onto a carpeted viewing stand erected across from the Union League House on Broad Street. There, Grant greeted the guests, and everyone watched the parade unfold. You can see him here. He was in the carriage before he left, saluting. He did the same thing on the stand, saluting military formations. He was waving his right hand. He raised his top hat to express his gratitude and appreciation, while waves of applause erupted from those around him. The martial bearing of the military received special notice. One newspaper, the Philadelphia Inquirer, reported quotes from the public buildings looking up Broad Street as their long line came gleaming on, touched by the splendor of the full glory of the noonday sun. The sight was one to stir the tamest spirit and to abide in memory for a lifetime. Wow, that's really something. Meanwhile, there's another side to the story. Word of the miniature and its purpose made its way to Mississippi, where editorial writers weren't too pleased. They took Frank to task. One of those writers in the Natchez Democrat observed, quote, Frank T. Weldon, who was not altogether unknown in this city, being a native Natchez boy, covered himself all over with glory the other day in Philadelphia and made it very evident that he is a hero worshiper of the first water, end quote. Another writer in the Clarion Ledger of Jackson, Mississippi, accused Frank of toadyism. Quote, if Mr. Weldon is really an ex-Confederate, it would have been a good idea to have added the figure of a golden toad embedded in the center of the table. Whilst the inscription might have run somewhat as follows. A diet of dirt can do no hurt to the reconstructed craw, and the scalawag lizard is good for the gizzard, whether taken roast of raw. But of all the rare and delicate dishes that are made of beasts or of birds or fishes, the daintiest thing of the modern mode is the savory smell of a well-done toad, end quote. So there's the Mississippi newspapers. Back in Philadelphia, at some point, Grant received the miniature table as a gift from Frank T. Weldon. I wasn't able to find a reference to the actual event, but we do know this because on Christmas Day, 1879, less than 10 days after the parade, President Grant wrote a thank you note to Frank. You'll find the note in Grant's papers, easy to find online. Grant stated in that note, quote, I acknowledge the receipt of the beautiful table, facsimile of the center table on which General Lee and myself signed the terms of the former's surrender at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, made of gold, and the still more highlighted expression with which it is accompanied, printed on satin. Both will have a sacred place among the souvenirs, which I hope to preserve through life, and then to transmit to my children as heirlooms to be preserved by them as equally sacred. The media picked up on Frank's Christmas gift to the president, and a number of newspapers across the country published the account. In fact, much of what I told you here comes from these reports and reports about the parade. So you may be wondering what happened to Frank, the ex-Confederate. Well, Frank Weldon died of liver cancer at age 70 on February 12th, 1910, on what would have been the 101st birthday of the man with whom Grant worked alongside to save the Union, Abraham Lincoln. Frank's wife and children survived him. And what about the table? Well, I spent a lot of time trying to find out if the table survived, and I was stumped. I had a funny feeling I had come to the end of the research rabbit hole, and it really bugged me. Then I had an idea. I contacted the Ulysses S. Grant Presidential Library at Mississippi State University on a whim just to find out if they might answer my request. I didn't wait very long. I soon received an email from Ryan P. Semmes, PhD. He's the library's director of research. Professor Semmes confirmed that 2 years after Grant's death, his widow, Julia Dent Grant, with the assistance of William Vanderbilt, donated the miniature table and other of Grant's memorabilia to the Smithsonian Institution. The table is pictured in an 1894 book called The American Civil War Book and Grant Album. Here is a picture of it's an inventory photograph in the Smithsonian Institution. And if we come up close and look at a detail, there is the golden miniature table. I've contacted the Smithsonian to see if I can get an appointment to visit and see it for myself. And when I do, I'll be posting some photographs. So thanks for listening. See you on the next episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail.